Hey, how are you doing, my friend? You doing all right?
I'm doing pretty good. I just want to confirm that you can hear me.
I can hear you. It is good to see you, Trey. What a treat. And Jacob, good to see you. And we have the wonderful Emilio as well. Jacob, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing really well, Daniel. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. I was telling Chetan that I've been falling down a rabbit hole trying to finish a book by the last day of this month that I started in 2016 and proceeded to sit over on that desk forever. It's funny how like, oh, I don't know, 8 years go by so quickly. It's like, what in the world? But hopefully we'll get it done. I'm on the conclusion. And the problem is with the conclusions, you're like, I shouldn't add this, I shouldn't add this, I shouldn't add this, and then you're like, no, I have to, and then an extra 70 pages come out of nowhere. So it's funny how that works. I fell down a rabbit hole because of Mr. Luber. I knew about Owen Barfield. He was a friend of Lewis and Tolkien and an Inkling, but it was a name that I had seen and never really read. And then I read him, like his book on language and also Saving the Appearances. And I'm like, how did I not know about this person? What is going on? Is this an example? It makes me think like, so something that's really fascinating with Owen Barfield is where he wants to really make an argument that thinking is actively participating in the world, that we're not separated from the world with our thinking. And it's just like, Flavio Plaurontic with the A is A critique and different things, and also obviously Hegel's Science of Logic. And also I've fallen down a rabbit hole. Another person I didn't really know about who's pretty insane is Rudolf Steiner. I'm like, how did I not know about this person? This is a fascinating thinker who's likewise trying to argue that thinking is not merely a representation of phenomenon, but it is actively part of the world and part of the creative order or part of different things. And what's very interesting with Mr. Barfield is he asks a question at the beginning of the book, and the way and if anyone can reply at any point, is he asks a question: Is a rainbow real? He asks, "Is a rainbow there?" Right? And it's a funny question because he's like, if you think about it, a rainbow exists because you have raindrops, you have light, and you have the eyeball, right? If there was no such thing as the eyeball, there wouldn't be a rainbow. But also, it doesn't make sense to say that it's merely subjective because many people could come along and see the rainbow, right? He calls it a shared representation, I believe, where a lot of people could see the rainbow. And so, likewise, he's like, if you're not there with the eye, if you don't have the element of the raindrops, the eyeball, and the light, you're not going to have the phenomenon of the rainbow. And therefore, the human subject, the human observer, plays a critical role in the rainbow being there, right? And he kind of asks the question, he's like, is it silly to say the rainbow doesn't exist? It's kind of silly to say the rainbow doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
And yet also it seems as if the human subject has a critical role in the rainbow being there, right? And then the question is, okay, so is a tree there the same as if a rainbow is there, right? We ask these kind of questions. And he's like, well, if we follow modern physics or whatever, it would seem that the tree is not there in the way we think for if you get to the quantum level and all those different things. And so why is it so crazy to think that the existence of the tree is that much different from the existence of a rainbow that is involving the presence of the human subject? And he's basing this on the work of Rudolf Steiner and his own thinking. And it's just interesting to me because the other thing I've been thinking about is you've got this whole tradition of thinkers who are critiquing Kant or the divide between thought, phenomenon, noumenon, and all these different things, and how they're not even taught. Like they're not taught in school. They're not known about, basically so much of what you learn in philosophy departments or colleges is very Kantian. Now, of course, I have to step back and say, one always wonders if the interpretation of Kant is just the popular, is it the deep, like scholarly, maybe the scholarly Kant would hear all this and be like, no, that's not what Kant really thinks. But that all aside, usually you get a kind of idea that all thought can do is represent, not actively participate, sort of in the world. And it makes me wonder: is there something about like Kantianism that capitalism likes? Is there something about Kantianism that the socioeconomic system likes because it kind of disempowers thinking, it disempowers the individual, and that's a reason why this line of thought that I like to call the counter-modern enlightenment has been ignored? And then it also, the last thing I'll say, and then pass it to whoever wants to speak, it feels to me like as AI develops, it's going to be extremely important for human beings to feel like their thinking actively participates in the world, because otherwise it's like, what's the point of the human being? if like the AI can just replace it, because even if the AI itself is stuck on the other side of the noumenon, just simply with Bayesian probability and reasoning, it seems like it has a really high likelihood of being more efficient and practical than human beings. And so then it's like, what's the point of us? So the other thing I've been thinking about is how this line of thinking of the counter-modern Enlightenment in general is going to become increasingly more important for humans to basically just handle the very existence of AI and the pathology that all of that comes from. So those are some of the things I've been exploring. Well, no, I've been very impressed with Owen Barfield. I think actually C.S. Lewis was reading Owen Barfield on his deathbed. And it's just amazing how he's another thinker that you're like, why did I not know about this person? So those have been thoughts, but it's wonderful to see all of you here today.
It's really wonderful to be here again. I agree with a lot of the things that you said, and it's weird because, for example, like in the case of the rainbow, right? Like light, water drops, and the eyeball. But also like you have those are all like physical things. You also have to have like the concept of a rainbow, right? If you don't have the concept of a rainbow, you just might see like a weird thing in the sky, like a weird refraction. You wouldn't actually perceive it as a rainbow. So there's also like the conceptual component, and it's interesting because we could say like, oh, like people in Egypt died of tuberculosis, but did they? Because like the concept of tuberculosis like didn't exist yet. So like, did they like die from that concept, because that concept wasn't like it didn't exist yet. This also reminds me of a professor I once had that you couldn't say like people from like the 1700s were like feminists, because like feminism wasn't like a thing yet. So you could say like they had like feminist ideas, but you cannot say that they were feminists because like that idea didn't exist at the time. So like it's really interesting to see like once we develop a concept, like to apply it retroactively, when at the time like that wasn't really a thing. But it's like really weird for us to imagine because it's almost like ingrained in our way of viewing at the world. And what you say about and well, this thinking of like the phenomenon, we always perceive it as external, like the rainbow, because like it's very ephemeral or like subtle. Our like concept and our eyeball, like those are like so ingrained with so those are so ingrained within ourselves that we don't really think of them as such. And I think that this could be like a normal thing, but I also think that science as a forcing force in our society makes us that way, because when science evaluates the world, it always leaves out the human, right? Because like psychology and something is like a social science, it's not like a hard science, right? So like since we are really little, they teach us to view the world without ourselves in it. So it's really weird. Like science get us into the habit of erasing ourselves, right? Like all our models of science, like of how the universe works, like we are not in them. Like if you're like planets and stuff, but like we're not in the models of like the physical forces, and it's really weird. And I think that it's not, and but it's also like it's really hard to think about oneself, because like thinking of yourself or your brain or your perception is like recursive. You're like the thinking thing is thinking of itself. So it's like recursive things are like really weird. Like in when you're like programming something, or like just like in cognition and stuff, when you're like thinking something recursive, it all like it kind of breaks down. It's like these really weird things start to happen. And regarding AI, like I think it could be like a really interesting thing for us as humans as a whole to find, because like so far like technological progress has been like a constant, right? And it's been good apparently, right? Like we have like New York fridge, and like they okay, so we have like programmed obsolescence, that so you could say like, oh, think get newer but not necessarily better. So you could see like kind of like the the things that don't quite add up, like the clinks in the armor, right? You're seeing like like technology is not necessarily like the savior we thought it was. And what it's true is that our material conditions have like definitely become like much better, right? I think that we have given up, like we don't realize that we have paid along the way with a lot of things, like for example community. Like nowadays we don't really have community like we did in like 300 years past. So we did pay with like spiritual or ephemeral things for our material like a progression. So we did pay for them, but generally speaking, like we did have to pay for them, but new technology became better, like faster phones, like bigger phones, brighter screens, etc. But with AI, we suddenly run into like a hitting point, because you could say like it's a natural progression of the technology. We have like these supercomputers that can analyze like billions of parameters over a long time. We have like all this computer power. Like of course, like AI is the next thing, and like technology feels unstoppable in the way of it advances. But it's but but I think that the nature of AI, it's like widely different from other technologies we've had, because people said like, oh, in the other technical like industrial revolution or something, like of course we lost some jobs, but we gained some jobs, and it's like, but like no, like this time is different. Like of course we're going to lose some jobs and maybe gain some jobs, but like the nature of the thing we are interacting with, it's not like a tool anymore, in the sense that like a tractor is, right? It's like, it's almost like a replacement of ourselves, and it's the first time that we have to like seriously consider like that maybe we don't want AI, which is like really hard, because like technological progression becomes almost like a religion in itself. It becomes unstoppable. It's something that you cannot, like there are like economic interests behind it and everything like this. And like, and I think like some arguments against AI are not as sound. Like for example, there's something like the attribution problem with AI, that I don't know, like artists like feel like they, like people get trained, the AI gets trained on the work of the artists, and the artists don't get paid. That's like a really big problem. But maybe if we still think that AI is a good thing, that could be solved in some way, right? That could be like something that could get solved. However, we want to think if we actually want AI. And there's this book that I haven't had time to read, but it's one of my favorite thinkers that I deeply respect, and he has like a whole book against AI. And when he wrote that book, I'm like, okay, like this might be serious. Like because most of the arguments were kind of like this, like we have to credit the artist and something, but like this book is basically like, no, like AI in itself is a bad idea, which is like such a like a opposite take on the like the mainstream view. So yeah, that's something really interesting. So I just want to share that. So yeah.
So thank you, Emilio. And no, last week, Mr. Ebert, good to see you. And last week we were talking about this problem, and the interesting issue where AI seems so different, as Mr. Ebert was pointing out, is it's very difficult to know where to draw the limit on what it can do and it cannot do. Like, for example, when the wheel was invented, you could say, oh, this may replace horses or something, because there was a sense of the technology having more of a bound to its certain facticity, right? Whereas with AI, it's kind of intelligent. So it's not clear what it can do, what it cannot do. And therefore, that's why it's kind of spooky, but then it's kind of exciting. And like I was saying to Tom and like Javier at the end, like I always am hesitant between doomsday talk. Like if we don't do X, we're all going to die. That seems kind of problematic. But then at the same time, there are things that can be problematic if you don't do or that you do, right? So all of those become interesting. And then what's fascinating, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert and then Trey, is this interesting issue, like you were mentioning with the Egyptians and the concepts. That's something that Steiner talks about, Rudolf Steiner, and kind of consciousness itself and its categories evolving, that I'm trying to get a better hold on, and how there's a retrospective going back, and that also would speak to Hegel. And it's just, again, fascinating to me that there were these thinkers like an Owen Barfield or a Steiner that seems to have offered this alternative line of thinking that just was not taught, and the questions become why, and what are the consequences of that? And that would link to, I think, with the science of logic. But Mr. Ebert, good to see you, sir. There you go.
Good. I popped in and you guys were talking about AI, and I was very, very happy. I want to share a conversation I had with ChatGPT 2 days ago. If humanity was experiencing, this is my prompt, was experiencing catastrophic food shortages and overpopulation of city centers due to human displacement, leading to widespread crime, financial collapse, and starvation, what would be the most direct short-term solution to preserve law and order and reduce starvation? Long story short, it says we may have to consider the it says we may have to consider the unimaginable. And I said, yes, I know that's difficult. I'm sorry, but this is the case. Is there anything we can do in the short term? And it said, it's difficult to discuss the idea of people being left to die in any situation. But in the hypothetical scenario you've presented, it may be necessary to consider the most humane way to handle a situation like this. One possibility could be to provide palliative care, etc. They also, by the way, earlier, and I just won't get into this part, they're like, we could split people up by the people most likely to die. We leave them behind, and the people that wouldn't die right away, we move them out of the city centers. I was like, okay. Anyway, and then it goes, another possibility could be to provide a humane way for people to end their lives. This could involve making available painless and peaceful ways to end one's life through medication under the guidance of a medical professional. Now, it's not that this was an irrational suggestion, but here's the interesting thing that I found, and I was shocked at my discovery. It was a discovery I discovered within myself as I'm prompting this thing. Now, I know that I'm manipulating the piece of AI to show that it's manipulatable, right? So I was very surprised to see that I had this experience nonetheless. And that experience was an offloading of my ethical decision-making to a supposedly objective entity. I had the distinct feeling of offloading liability, responsibility, and guilt. Because even though I was manipulating, I still am inculcated with this notion that this thing is, despite my ability to manipulate it, more objective than I'm capable of being. There is a certain goddishness to this thing, right? That's why we're all talking about it. We're kind of in awe. And so I experienced the offloading of my ethics. And I suddenly realized that this is a use case for AI that's not being discussed, that I bet you is already being implemented in terms of decision-making, who to fire, how many people to fire, that sort of thing at the moment. But definitely something that's going to be utilized in difficult ethical decision-making at the governmental level, sure, corporate level, yes, but also at the interpersonal level. And and that is a real trip. And essentially what it spells is the death of ethics in an embodied way. So I wanted to bring that up as like a total discovery that I had not considered until I started fucking with GPT.
Well, Mr. Ebert, I'm gonna go take a walk. No, I really like what you just said. That's magnificent. It makes me think of a few things. And then Mr. Lunat, I know you had your hand up. You're more than free to speak. There's a few things that makes me think of that's really interesting. One, David Hume was really concerned about moral theories because he was like, hey, when you separate like ethical action to kind of these abstract theories as opposed to communal life and sentiment, you can just like do whatever and it doesn't matter how you impact people. And that's one of the reasons very important that David Hume deconstructs is and ought is because he believes that ought ends up turning into a terror, actually. He's actually trying to defend common life. The second thing it makes me think of is Benjamin Fontaine, who is another counter-modern Enlightenment thinker, who was basically like, hey, you know what the problem with the Enlightenment is? It basically says you're not responsible for thinking because it's just objectively rational to do X, Y, and Z. And as a result, you end up in totalitarianism. Because what Benjamin Fontaine was like, he was big for, there's a guy named Levo Shestov, Sestop, I can never say his name. And his whole thing was the necessity of the impossible. And what he meant by that, maybe it's a little bit like the event or like in Quentin M. After Finitude, like the breaking through of the divine, the different thing. But with Levat, he was like, if you don't have a society that believes in the impossible, you're a slave to the rational. And the rational leads to just people like not being responsible, like, well, we just got to do it because it's rational in different things. And the last thing, and I'd not thought about using AI that way, that's disturbing. And it makes me think of the George Clooney movie Up in the Air, where companies, when they want to fire a bunch of people, they bring in like George Clooney to come in and do the firing for them, because the companies don't want to do the firing because it's too difficult. So they bring in George Clooney and Up in the Air. And now I can't help but think of companies or governments or whatever saying, hey, we got to fire these 1,000 people. It's not that we want to. We just don't have a choice because it's the most efficient thing to do for the stockholders or for the business. And they'll be like, not our fault, not our fault. And governments may do the thing. They'll be like, man, we ran all the models and we have no choice but to do drone warfare on this country or whatever. And that offsetting of responsibility is really disturbing. And the last thing I'll say, we mentioned Owen Barfield. What's really interesting about Barfield is he also kind of makes the point that, like, if thinking is not part of reality, then you don't have to take responsibility for reality. And he actually kind of uses it in an environmentalist way, where he's like, if the concept and the percept are two sides of the same creative act, not split down the wall, then there's less emphasis to kind of take responsibility for the world. So there was kind of like an environmental kind of push there as well that makes me think of. But I'll give it back to you, Mr. Ebert, and then give it to Trey. Please. Yes.
Can I just add one thing to that? This is something that I forgot to mention, but it's something I've been working on for a while. I think I've mentioned it here before. One thing that ties into this in terms of the responsibility you're talking about is that it's already argued by legal scholars, and I've known this for a while, but I hadn't put it together with what I just discovered, that AI already has legal personhood. Now, the idea of legal personhood, of course, is limiting the liability of people who either use something or who develop something, if that something ends up going and destroying the world or something, right? So if AI has legal personhood and limits the liability of the users, then the ethical decisions that we receive from it, if followed, the outcomes of those ethical decisions themselves could literally limit the liability of the people enacting those measures and refer the liability back to the artificial intelligence, which is sort of a completion of the death of ethics.
Yeah, I was reading that case study and I don't even know where the ruling was, where they were arguing who's liable for if a self-driving car wrecks or whatever. And I think that's really, really fascinating. So yeah, great times. All right. I need stronger coffee. So Trey, good to see you, sir. Please.
Hey, it's good to see you, Daniel. We haven't spoken so long. But thanks for having me here. I've never really joined one of these calls because I'm usually working at this time. But everyone, during Emilio's talk and then Alexander and you, I had so many different questions. But for the safety of the net, I'll just try and limit it to one or two. So I was just wondering, Daniel, about now that we're talking about AI, I'm wondering, because you were telling me you were reading Heidegger and you're doing like a deep dive into Heidegger and stuff. So I was sort of wondering, what's your take on a Heideggerian view of AI? Because I think I remember I was messaging you about my concerns with Heidegger, or at least the early Heidegger, and the way he understood subjectivity and personhood and stuff. And I remember reading the book he published, I think it was the next book after Being in Time. And he wrote all of Being in Time, and then he realized in the next book, oh wait, I didn't actually explain what it means to be a human. Like how are humans unique? And basically, from my understanding, the answer he gives is that human beings have a unique relationship towards the possibilities for the future. And so we have animals are limited to their life world, so they project possibilities, but it's only within this limited environment. And then humans sort of have this explosive space of freedom where they can do all these different things. Now, my main concern, especially and it just came to me after Alexander was talking about AI and how AI even has like legal personhood, and it has, and what Emilio was saying about AI having so many more possibilities for the future, for even understanding. What do we mean by understanding? My issue is that there doesn't seem to be anything that separates Heidegger or Heidegger's Heidegger's projection towards the future and just AI using data, I don't know what ontologically separates these two, so that we can't just say, oh, AI is actually the most powerful Dasein, you know, because it takes on a life of its own. It is projected towards, it can optimize and stuff. So that was my, and like with when Alexander mentioned how AI has some legal personhood, it reminded me of something I was reading from John Zazula's, the theologian and Orthodox metropolitan who actually recently passed away. He was writing about how the Roman understanding of personhood was limited, and by the fact that the person was reduced to it didn't have this absolute character because it was just a member of a larger social organism. And I almost feel like Heidegger's understanding of Dasein, where there seems to be some sort of homology here between there not being an actual subject who has this absolute character, but it's just Dasein who's always already with the world and part of this larger totality. There seems to be a similar idea here. And the main concern that I have is that it undermines the absolute character of the person. And this is why I always found Zizek interesting, and his critiques of Heidegger interesting, because even though I disagree with Zizek's understanding of the subject, at least he has a subject, right? So that was basically my question for you. Like, from a Heideggerian perspective, do you think Heidegger has the conceptual tools to deal with AI, especially given the fact that AI, there seems to be some sort of ambiguity? And I'm sure there are Heideggerians who can defend Heidegger in this respect, but I'm having trouble seeing how AI misses the or how AI is essentially different from Dasein, given the fact that it is self-optimizing. And Heidegger rejects subjectivity, so you can't actually say that, oh, it's actually because AI doesn't have this self-referentiality, because Heidegger doesn't seem to necessarily go that route with his rejection of Cartesianism.
That's an excellent question. So a few things. One, this is the part where you're like, weren't you going to do a deep dive on Heidegger? Yeah, you know, I started that, and then I discovered Owen Barfield, Rudolf Stein, needed to finish up Belonging again, and it's the end of February. However, you know, it's funny how that works, and then the wedding season and different things. However, that said, a few things. One, I think, like, the great Thomas Wynne, who I love and adore, and he always makes this point, and I think it's true, that Dasein is kind of like a thought experiment, where he's not, like, Dasein is not supposed to be the subject. The notion is, if we were to think of a being like Dasein, what are some possibilities that would open up that otherwise would not open up, right? Now, the critique of that would be like, all right, well, whatever you find, though, Heidegger, you're not necessarily going to be able to walk back to the subject if you're starting in a thought experiment, right? Like, a counter would be like when you say, oh, whatever conclusions you draw on the trolley problem, for example, right? Well, can you really come up with sort of like universal ethical problems from that thought experiment that would help you deal with your daily life? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you can just get a PhD out of it or something like that. Hard to say. So definitely what Heidegger, and it's very interesting, Dr. Nieberhauser on his website will do a lot about the problems of technology and AI, and how AI is the logical end of philosophy of the standing reserve, where everything is just techna thinking, you know, the reduction of things into simply standing reserve. AI would be the logical extension of that, right? So, you know, for someone like Dr. Nieberhauser, you know, AI basically would be what Heidegger said, yeah, that's where you're going to end up. Now, what you may really enjoy, because I talk with the wonderful Thomas Jockin about this all the time. Thomas Jockin and Nieberhauser had an outstanding conversation about Aristotle and Heidegger, and if Heidegger, by not having a metaphysics of essence, actually has any way to stop thinking from being standing reserve. And so that's kind of the critique that Mr. Jockin comes out with. Like, without a metaphysical doctrine of something like essence. No, it doesn't have to be essence, you know, like Aristotle, but you can, like, it would be like Heidegger accurately diagnoses a problem, but then cuts out from under him the possibility of stopping that problem, right? Now, this is where Thomas Wynne says, okay, but that's where Heidegger then goes to the introduction of metaphysics. And you know, he was talking with Cadell about like how the phenomenology of spirit in Hegel is like being in time for Heidegger. And then as, you know, Hegel then goes to the science of logic, which is his quote unquote main project. Likewise, Heidegger goes to the introduction of metaphysics as kind of his main jibe. And what it seems to be the case, what I call it, is that Heidegger seems to want to create a doctrine of intersuppositional. It's not subjectivity, but that the essence of being arises within the encounter of a being that discloses itself in its quote unquote suchness. So the relation itself, not the I object, but the relation is what is essential. And the disclosure of that relation then becomes the way to fight against standing reserve technology or different things like that. I think that's what Heidegger would say, but then the question would be, one, what does that mean? Two, who decides what are the practical implications of X relationship? What does that indeed mean? And then three, what I've been writing recently, you know how Zizek has that part where he's like, what would Hegel say to Marx? He kind of flips it instead of what Marx says to Hegel, but Hegel says to Marx. I've been thinking a lot about what people like Owen Barfield, Rudolf Steiner, and what they would say to Heidegger. Because it's really mysterious to me that Heidegger doesn't seem to know about any of these thinkers who want to be arguing that thought and percept means perception of, like my perception of the laptop and the idea of the laptop, how those are two sides of the same coin. That to me would be a very, very valuable tool to Heidegger's thinking, and to think in those terms, as well as any of the critiques of A as A that we've talked about before. And because that would make the relation primary, it'd be an AB, right? It would be like you mentioned, or a communal ontology, right? Different things like that, which would then allow Heidegger to argue, no, the essence is the relation and the community, and that, because the problem is with AI is it gets in the way of community because you're relating to the AI as if it's a person, and then you become confused about personhood and therefore lose the ability of having an essence found in relation. But he doesn't seem to know about that thinking. And actually, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. One of the things that I think is really important to do today in philosophy studies is basically to imagine what it would be like if Owen Barfield were to talk with Heidegger. Because that didn't happen, maybe because they didn't have the internet, they didn't have access to information, there's no way to know these things. But there are like these conversations that you could you could ask ChatGPT to imagine it, but I don't know if it's going to do a good job. Because like where Rudolf Steiner uses a certain language that's different from, they all use different languages. And so I think it would be difficult for the AI to know where the languages overlap. Whereas a person could say, oh, what Owen Barfield is talking about is kind of similar to what Bergson is talking about. And that actually might have overlap with Heidegger, where you could do that investigation to help bring one another out. I think that's going to actually be a line of work that as AI develops is going to be something really important for people interested in abstract reasoning to do. Like right now, basically the Heidegger project, which became the philosophical developmentalism paper, which became questions of like, what exactly does it mean in Rudolf Steiner? And so right now, I basically have a conversation between Rudolf Steiner, Owen Barfield, and Heidegger. I also really like Dorothy Sayers. She's technically not an Inkling, I don't think, but she did a book called Mind of the Maker you may like. I really like that book. And then people like all the other counter-enlightenment thinkers. So that's what I would say as off your excellent question.
Yeah, that was very insightful, and the point you made about the standing reserve is that's kind of what I miss. And I guess I haven't read any later Heidegger at all. I'm just working with him being in time and concepts of fundamental concepts of metaphysics, and yeah, that would be the part that I missed, right? Because he does have some. You can see how AI would be like the ultimate standing reserve, right? But I think like what you said about who was it you mentioned? Was it a Thomas Jockin?
Thomas Jockin.
I think it was Thomas Jockin who had the question about Heidegger. And do you mind just repeating that? What his with his discussion with, was it
Johannes Niebuhrhauser.
Yeah, Johannes, right. So what was his critique? Because I remember that was something significant that you said.
Oh no, it's quite excellent, and there's a recording on Dr. Niebuhrhauser's site for any inadequacies I may bring about in explaining it. But basically, Heidegger accurately identifies that autonomous, purely rational thought, as I would call it, autonomously rational thought reduces things to basically standing energy sources for whatever humans want to use it for. And Heidegger's like, that's a problem, because then you're not struck by the being of the entity, right? A tree does not disclose itself as a tree. Well, but Heidegger at the same time is very much against metaphysics of like essence, all of that Aristotle stuff, because for him, it's precisely that metaphysics which leads to standing reserve. That's his whole critique, that like Western metaphysics led to technology as we know it today, and it's destroying it all. Now, that may not be true. Then one can go through and say, is that actually correct? But taking Heidegger for his word of it, Mr. Jockin comes along and says, hey, but if you're telling me that a tree doesn't have an essence that makes it essentially a tree beyond its accidents, why shouldn't it be used for lumber? Where does your ethics come from then? And it's very interesting because Heidegger basically seems to talk as if ethics is ontology. If you have a strong enough of an ontology of being, that discloses also the ethics of which would follow from that ontology. Is that true? Someone like Derrida comes along and he's like, really? Is that the case? And so that's the debate. Now, I think the counter to Mr. Jockin is basically to say, no, the essence of things is their very disclosure. The way that the tree discloses itself is, in fact, how it should be honored. Okay? Who says? You know, you still have an ethical problem, right? So this is why we're someone like Aristotle, the collections of like ethics, ontology, all of these are really tied together. And then, of course, for Mr. Ebert's point, and then I'll pass it to Jacob here, if we like hand our ethics off to AI, that would have very deep ontological consequences for what is the human being. Like, what exactly are we if we're not actually making ethical decisions for ourselves? And that would be something to be said, but more would have to be said on that. But let me hand it to Jacob. Jacob, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you. Good to be with you. And yeah, just appreciating this high level discourse on Heidegger. It's really opening some things up for me. And I wanted to feed back in, bringing it back to this question of AI in the future. What's coming through for me is a reflection on the possibility of a very pronounced differentiation in what it means to be human coming down the line, in which you kind of have this like reciprocal, recursive relationship developing with AI. Kind of think about human beings with a smartphone, but times 10x or 100x, including people offloading the education of their children to AI, which kind of somehow tucks into that, what's the nature of personhood and relationship and how do we develop as people? What if you have groups of children that are raised by AI and groups of children that are raised by human beings? And then if you think about like what happens if you are not conscious in your relationship to technology, you're not conscious in your relationship to the iPhone, and then you have market capital and other things kind of designing how that feedback loop's going to play out, but then you jack it up to the power of n with AI, what kind of human begins to emerge out of that? And then at the same time, I get this sense that every time AI comes into the net, into this conversation space, that it's just like this, almost like this shadow that weaves in and out of every single area of discourse. And it's somehow like acting upon our relationship to all these different areas of discourse. And it seems to me to be in some ways like an evolutionary catalyst of the conversation itself. And that's just happening. We're in that recursive relationship. So there's almost a forking in the road of the possibility of what it means to be human that I'm seeing, where there's like this one possibility of a recursive relationship to it that is producing one kind of human, and another that's like we engage in this almost philosophical arms race with AI at every level as it goes on, and then that actually is leading to a deeper, more beautiful essence being expressed, or something like that.
That's a magnificent comment. And what you just said, basically, I think the very fact that the AI just keeps weaving itself in the conversation, one, shows that Heidegger is correct about the way that technology integrates into our very mode of being. Like, and then that's something like a Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman. They're like, the way consciousness experiences the world before the book is different from how it experiences after the book. And every single technology is like that. Like, you know, the way we put it in the paper representing beauty is today, it's impossible to experience a beautiful sunset and not think, oh, that would be a beautiful picture. Like that possibility is now forever part of the world. Every beautiful sunset could be a beautiful picture, right? And so is that good? Is that bad? it's kind of indifferent if you could handle not to be controlled by the picture. Because what you see today is basically people are almost like nervous about taking pictures. Like they're like nervously taking pictures all the time, and they don't even look at them. Like you take a million pictures at a birthday party, and then people don't even print pictures anymore and hang them up. So is it really a good thing, or is it just like a nervousness? And really, to Mr. Ebert's point on the inability to determine the limit of AI, the problem is if you could theoretically take a picture whenever you want, because you don't have film and you always have your phone on you, why don't you? It poses an existential question where every moment you have to actively choose, say, not to take a picture, right? And if you're at your cousin's birthday party, don't you love your cousin? Don't you think that it's a beautiful day? Shouldn't you be capturing it? And so suddenly you're now in a sort of nervousness about perpetually taking pictures, because if you're not, it says something about your love for your cousin, right? It says that you don't actually think this is a cool party, or you're worrying that other people think that, right? Oh crap, if other people don't see me taking pictures, what if they think I'm not having a good time? I better signal that. So what ends up happening with technology is there's a mixture of a possibility that creates a nervousness. Yes, he does, Trey, you're right. Han is brilliant on a lot of that. And so like the picture creates a nervousness of taking pictures so you don't lose something. Then there's an ethic, there's an existential nervousness, and all of those different things that come together. And Heidegger's insight is the awareness that technology does that, like that it has this consciousness transformation to it. Now, also Rudolf Steiner seems to have realized that. And there are that's what's interesting to me. There are thinkers that are like, you go through history, consciousness in its very apprehension of the world changes for good and for bad. Now, we always have to remember, evolution doesn't necessarily mean good. It can just, it's relative to a feedback loop with the environment, right? So there's not necessarily like a positive doctrine, it's just the observation that things change. So likewise, is it good or is it bad that people have the camera today? Well, it seems to depend on what the subject does. But Chetan, let me give it to you, my good man. So no, I think Heidegger, this point that you're making on the AI elevating, moving the conversation around, that does speak to a great insight of Heidegger. And it makes me think, I call it towardness, like the way we are toward things change. But let me give it to Chetan here.
I think a wonderful discussion, actually. And, I would want to go back to Ebert's point, and which is a wonderful point about ethics in that sense. And I just remembered the same question actually emerged in Eichmann's case, if anybody can remember that in that sense. When Eichmann was put on trial, his sort of argument, for his crimes under Hitler regime, he was kidnapped, brought into Israel, that whole story. And when he was put to trial, his argument from his side was that I was just following the orders.
Right. Yeah.
Isn't it? And you trying to hold me under a set of laws that, and Arendt's whole conception of banality of evil was exactly that he's a man who can't think for himself. She had already identified that problem of modernity, of creating, and she placed that man within the contours of what you call bureaucracy in that sense. So already one can see that bureaucracy in some senses intersects with this construction of a technical object, of which ChatGPT might be the technical object par excellence, but it is a construction of a technical object. And if we take the story seriously of construction of technical objects, it has already been entangled with thinking right since Socrates. So Socrates' sort of opposition of writing and thinking, if you remember, Socrates did not want to write. He didn't want to write because he thought that his thinking, and whether Socrates is right there or not is the moot point here at this point. What is important is that when he opposed something like writing to thinking, he already opposed or showed that there is a destructive possibility to a technical object which can obstruct thinking in that sense, thinking for your own self. If you create a technical object, and even if you think about, say, movement from Hegel to Marx, and you think about materialism in that sense. So in Hegel, when you exteriorize something, it gets re-interiorized in dialectics. That's the dialectical movement in some senses, isn't it? Marx showed that exteriorization involves materiality. It always is entangled with materiality. So the dialectical movement that exists in Hegel needs to be thought through material turn in that sense. But if we think through this problem of exteriorization and in this link to technology, because it's always linked to techno in one sense or the other. You cannot, and Derrida showed in response to Socrates, that any thinking involves external support. So you are already always embedded in techne in that sense, language and so on and so forth. So if you take this turn seriously of the relationship between the technical support that you need for thinking, and at what point thinking gets outsourced to the technical support itself, that's the discussion, isn't it? That you need certain technical support, technical objects for your capacity to think, and at a certain point, the same technical objects can replace your thinking capacity itself, and that and that is where I think the ethical question of Ebert is placed for us, because we're reaching a point where I think very idea of life is getting diverted into what we might call this exteriorization of technical objects that we are creating, without this reinteriorization being possible of Hegel. That's what is happening. We've created such stable external structures that life is sort of moving through them rather than through us in some senses. You can talk about intensive dimension of deluge or whichever way you think about it. But there is this exteriorization which cannot be reinteriorized, at least not easily in our times. And that is where Hegel becomes important in a good and a bad way both. And I think we can see what is at stake here.
So now so I have the title for the net. We're going to call it Eichmann with AI. It's going to be great. So like Eichmann in Jerusalem, Eichmann with AI. That's a fascinating comment you made. I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. A key point of Benjamin Fontaine, or a different point, is if you can outsource ethical responsibility to AI, then it starts to be irrational not to do it. Why wouldn't you outsource it to the AI? Why wouldn't you let the computer make the decisions for you? Because if it makes a bad decision, it's not your fault. Or there's like a little bit of a buffer. Of course, people would accuse you for putting the input, but you're like, but I thought it would be best. We all thought. So what Benjamin Fontaine warns is once you invent that technology, not only is there the incentive to escape the existential tension of an ethical choice to give it to the AI, but then you can also claim it's rational and that you're just doing it because it's the smart thing to do. So then, and this is why I like, for Hume and all these people, autonomous rationality is problematic, where you just say, I'm only doing what's rational, or I'm just following my duty. And it's kind of rational to be Eichmann and claim I was just following the law. One, because it's a great defense on trial, and two, it's kind of believable, right? You say, oh, he's just following the law, but that's kind of I really think that book, I think Hannah Arendt in that book really put her finger on the problem with like autonomous rationality, or the ability to, or the banality of evil, which again, what's so important. By banality of evil, she does not mean evil is freaking boring. She means it is thoughtless in that context, which does not mean stupid, but something like automatic. I'm just automatically doing it because the law says. It's basically, in a funny way, Eichmann is like, hey, I'm just the AI and I have the inputs put in me by the law. I just had the inputs put in me by the state. I just have to do. I don't control the inputs. It's not my fault. So there's a kind of way in which Eichmann, in that banality of evil situation, is saying, I'm just a victim of the inputs. I just have to go from there. And like that's something. And to think of Nazism in those terms is terrifying. But I think a really useful reference here, Chiton, is very good. Let me give it to Trey.
Thank you. Yeah, those are some great points made, especially about what you were saying about the problem of rationality and how AI is basically, I mean, hyper rationality. It is, the problem isn't therefore when there are certain critiques of technology that it's an irrational drive for more and more control and stuff, when actually this is a point Zizek makes. Technology is increasingly becoming a rational giving over of our what had previously essentially weighed us down to autonomous technological forces. And AI is the culmination of that up until this point in history. And it just reminded me of one of my favorite philosophers and theologians, Pavel Florensky, who we've talked about before, and his critique of rational thought, because for him, and I know you'll relate a lot to this, Daniel, the problem with rationality is that its law is A equals A. So you have this the issue of A equals A logic, which this just reminds me of the first point you made in our talk today, where you were talking about the rainbow and asked the question, does the rainbow exist without the eye? And you can ask the same question does A exist without B? And it's pretty clear that no, A does not exist without B, because the differentiation of A as an individual determinant, or not even determinant, but just a individual, that distinction is already presupposes logically the existence of B, of some otherness for which it can distinguish itself, which is why the God of the philosophers, as it's come to be called in Orthodoxy, or Orthodox theology, is the monism, where everything is reduced to the one, right? And there's no distinctions in the one, but therefore you don't have any capacity for personhood or creative or concrete determinate existence, and that's a big problem for us. And the last point I'll make, just kind of return to Heidegger, is really the last thing I want to mention. I know we've kind of moved on to different topics, but when something that struck me when you were talking about the essence of the tree, for example, and I remember, I can't believe I forgot, you've already told me this, about how the tree, the problem is that if the tree doesn't have an essence, how can we justify not just using it as standing reserve? And from an Orthodox perspective, that would be true. That's a legitimate question. But also we would ask, and kind of to transition away from material objects to persons, to human beings, what makes the person what makes the person not able ethically, what makes it ethically wrong to use the person as standing reserve? Now, for if we I don't think that the person can be reduced to essence. That's kind of the issue I would have, just remaining within a logic of essence, because there are people who would say, oh, the essence of the human is just to be a material entity who comes in to being and then passes away. But for us, and for Orthodox theology, the person is this absolute point, this absolute singularity, unrepeatable and eternal, because once created by God, there is no passing away. So for us, the person has this absolute character. Actually, Zazoulas says that the person is the absolute concept. So actually taking some of Hegel's stuff there. So the one thing I wanted to mention is that if you would ask the question you asked about the disclosure of the tree, is the essence of the tree disclosure? Well, we would ask, I don't think we could affirm that in the context of a person. Is the essence of the person disclosure? Because therefore the person doesn't have this character of an absoluteness, but is only a person insofar as it is disclosed to Dasein, or whatever term you want to use, but it doesn't have this absoluteness in itself. And actually, final point is that it reminds me of Zazoulas. He begins his book, Being as Communion, talking about the development of the notion of person. And actually the term prosopon, or that's the Roman term, but the Greek term, it was only used or mostly only used to refer to masks that people wore in plays, and it kind of reminds me of the return of this idea of just a mask, with the Cartesian theater, and this idea of Heidegger talking about how if you just have autonomous thought, if you're not essentially participating in your life world, you just have this Cartesian subject and then the theater. And there seems to be a conceptual link between understanding the subject just as this mask, and not as a being who is absolute in itself, yet also always already participating in its life world. So you have this idea of, there's the mask, and then there's the Cartesian theater with the autonomous subject. But yeah, that's all I had to say about Heidegger. It just struck me that, from my perspective, I think the direction I would go to even begin answering the question would be to look into a philosophy and ultimately a theology of the person, and what does it mean to be a person, because I think that this main issue is kind of what has been I haven't found necessarily satisfactory answers in the philosophical tradition of modernity, but your talk in the counter enlightenment seems to reveal new paths forward in that respect.
But you know, to your defense, unfortunately, that has not been part of the conversation. Really, it's been modernism versus postmodernism, and then we've kind of been trapped there, and then it just all turned into neo-pragmatism with Richard Rorty. Not even frickin' C.S. Peirce. It's really unfortunate. But I'll pass it to Mr. A few things. One, I must say, as a point of note, I understand that there is a stupid amount of Heidegger that has never been translated. So anything I say about Heidegger could be countered by something that has never been translated. Also, too, I think Heidegger, when it's the disclosure, what's very tricky is that disclosure seems to be a term that means the between space almost. The clearing seems to be more of an emphasis in Heidegger than even being. This is what's kind of weird. And the clearing is, and when I say intersuppositional, that means the grounding of the logic is based in the very emergent space. And I want to use the word emergent here, which I know is a fancy word everyone likes to use now, but this kind of surprise of which can only happen in a relational context when the relation is not defined in terms of I and other or subject and object, but the relation itself becomes the essence. Like relations are primary, and those are what for Heidegger is essential, which then, if that's a correct reading, you would certainly have in that something like a communal ontology, or at least an opening to that. Now, of course, Heidegger himself may be like, no, but it's also very interesting where I've been making a distinction at the end of the Belonging Again book between meaning and belonging, because I actually think in the conversation today, a lot of those are conflated and they're not actually the same thing. Like I can have meaning by writing books, but the more I write books, I may have less belonging from the people around me because they have no idea what I'm doing and I'm a crazy person. And I actually think we're making a huge mistake today to assume that if you regain meaning, you will also regain belonging. Where in the past, that may have been more so the case because everyone kind of shared technological or factual settings. Like if you lived on a farm, everyone around you tend to be on a farm as well. But today, I can be doing philosophy with you guys while my neighbor is fixing pipes, while the person across from there is a Hindu and the other person's a Christian, right? So your social setting is much more diverse. And you won't necessarily find belonging in or fittedness in that community just because you find a meaning-making practice. Now, that doesn't mean meaning is bad, but it just simply means that meaning and belonging are not necessarily the same thing. And the reason that's important is because in more classical thought, the human had to find fittedness, of which was belonging in a community. So you could not, and it's interesting, as there's been an emphasis on essence or the person or the individual, there's been more of a stress on meaning, which can be more individualized if you are not careful. Now, I'm not saying every single person that talks about meaning means that. I'm not trying to make those claims, but it is interesting, Trey, that like classically speaking, there can be an emphasis between fittedness and simultaneously one's own passion. Like that's kind of a transformation there. There seems to be a ditch on either of them because of course belonging does what? Oh, I belong in Nazi Germany. I'm finding my community as a Nazi and now you're evil. But then likewise, meaning can be kind of self-congratulatory, right? So there's some sort of bothness that has to occur that's being missed in the conversation. Certainly, and then I'll pass it to Mr. Ebert, certainly, in my opinion, classical notions of essence have to be rethought. And this is where I'm interested in the apprehensive act, the apprehension, like in the paper on typography, and finding essence in that apprehension itself, which would be more communal, if you will, or clearing based, as opposed to saying we're going to defend the tree by getting to the essence of a tree. Because of course, now you could just be looking at Foucault and he's like, I told you guys, that doesn't work so well in different things. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert.
Oh, a lot of good shit. So just scattered thoughts because there's a lot of sort of disparate ideas floating around. Okay. Wanted to potentially counter the idea that Trey, if I said that name right, proposed, which is that the differentiating factor of the individual is their singularity, their sort of unrepeatable interior, let's say, or the the singularity, the apophatic sort of unity of self. But that's also, or rather, I would even say, actually what makes us all fungible. That at least in Hegel and my own freak theory, the very thing that creates a singularity is a density of relation that negates relation internal to the subject. So you have what Hegel would call an infinite self-relation. And the reason the singularity is created is because you have a collapse of differentiation within the self. That collapse of differentiation is always going to be isomorphic to any other collapse of differentiation. So for instance, in set theory or whatever the case, or actually the easiest is just to take a subset of real numbers, which are always going to be infinite. Any subset between 1 and 2, you take that subset. That's an infinite subset. And it's going to be isomorphic to the entirety of the real numbers. So, in other words, the very fact of our singularity, no matter what, and that to me is also, by the way, what relates Hegel to rhizomatic sort of theory and all of these ideas. Like, if this fist, internal to this fist, is an infinite self-relation, which has therefore, by necessity, is there in order to manifest the determinate form on the exterior, so the indeterminate interior against the limitation of hand to form the fist, thereby my fist is isomorphic to the entire universe, and therefore relates to everything by being in a collapse of relation. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out there. And then that relates to, this notion of like, what are we personhood and what are we reduced to? And can you sort of, I'm not super familiar with Agamben, but the idea of pure life and Homo sacer and biopolitics, I'm starting to feel like I'm just a lop of meat. I'm a little jealous of GPT chat and these other things. They are now outperforming our purpose. And when we talk about meaning, I don't think meaning ever evaporates. I think in a lot of ways, what people are talking about when they talk about meaning is actually purpose. Purpose requires obstacles, requires some sense of usefulness. Maybe usefulness is better because purpose has problems with, Nietzsche and others, but like a sense of usefulness. Now, I can only be useful if there's a problem for me to solve, or something, essentially a problem, something that I can help, like, facilitate, right? And the more we sort of narrow the opportunity for our own usefulness vis-a-vis technology, the less sense of purpose we're going to have. I wouldn't say the less sense of meaning. I can make meaning out of nothing. Nothing is meaningful. So it's probably the most meaningful thing. But I will feel a lack of usefulness and a lack of purpose. And I think that, in there's something, and I guess, yeah, it's a difficult question to get into the idea of like, well, so the GPT chat thing I prompted is like, okay, well, you just have to kill a third of the, of humanity and you start over. It's like Thanos in the Avengers, right? Thanos is actually a good guy, right? He wants to kill half of humanity to save the planet. And, and that's the trope, of course, with most bad guys these days. They're all good guys, most of them, actually, a lot of them are environmentalists these days, and like the Avengers or Samuel L. Jackson in the Kingsman, or you have all these bad guys who are good guys, but they're taking it too far. Anyway, so this idea of like, of ethics, like at scale, may or may not come to the fore as like a real problem and something that we almost certainly would prefer to outsource to some, objective mind. And at that question, we will have to wonder, well, what is a human? Is a human a snowflake, like an act, like special? Or are we actually all isomorphic with one another? And the only thing that's actually special is the determinate form that we take in these bodies. And otherwise, the very fact that we're isomorphic with the rest of the universe means we're the same as the rest of the universe, which means we're all the same with the rest of the universe, which means none of us are special, except that all of us are special. So these are all super, difficult existential questions that we may or may not have to confront in real life, but it's always still interesting to confront here with care, because of course anything can be taken and used as ideology.
No, that's outstanding. I'll pass it to Trey here. Yeah, I definitely think it's interesting how all the bad guys are actually good guys, and it's just they're out of order. Which one is interesting because it suggests that every value, when it is not properly quote unquote fitted within a concert of other values, can actually be problematic, right? Like it's good to save humanity, but if you kill half of humanity in saving it, maybe not so much.
But what's interesting, though, I find interesting in the Avenger movies, right? So Thanos kills half the population. That's sad. I get it. But the reason the Avengers go back in time to stop him doing that is because they killed like 3 or 4 people they really cared.
Yeah.
And they're so broken up about losing like so-and-so and so-and-so that they're like, let's go back. And Downey Jr.'s like, Iron Man's like, listen, if we go back, we like literally everyone may die. Like we got lucky. And they're like, it's worth it. Now, and then, Thanos is like, you guys are like incorrigible. And he's like, yep, we're all kinds of crazy. And it's like, yeah, humans were crazy, but we do. And there's something just dumb about it, actually. Not even enchantingly dumb, just dumb. And yet it's become part of our sort of almost patriotic fervor that we're stupid, and that we would rather have these sort of micro replications of a macro love or of existence than actually persist as a species or have world peace or anything like that. And that's become part of our sort of like patriotic fervor that like humans. And it may end up being, by the way, the big differentiating factor between us and AI. It's like, yeah, AI is perfect and we're not. And that's why we're amazing and blah, blah, blah. And yes, we kill ourselves and we're suicidal and homicidal, but that's the best part. I mean, we're really, yeah, I mean, Freud would just be loving, talk about civilization as discontents. It's next level at this point. Yeah.
Mr. Ebert, I really appreciate it because now I understand why all the Marvel movies have sucked since the Endgame. It's because of that. Like now it all makes sense. So Javier, good to see you, sir. I'll pass it to Trey. The thing I was going to say. So first off, yeah, if you look at Kierkegaard, basically Kierkegaard's like the only way to escape the kind of prison of rationality is some sort of leap of faith. And by faith, he's kind of means something absurd, like an absurd act. And then Lewosowski and Fondaine, all these people are like the impossible. And like Fondaine straight up says he's a defender of the irrational. Like by irrational, by that I think he means non-rational, but it's like that is what is human. And what does that mean, right? In different things. The other thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it to Trey. I think it's really important the point you're making, where when a lot of people talk about meaning, they talk about usefulness. That's what I mean when I like belonging is usefulness. You're part of a community, you're part of something, you belong here. And for me, it's a big mistake, in my opinion. I'm not saying every thinker in the community of the meaning crisis makes this mistake, but belonging and meaning are not the same thing. And you have to carry that distinction because belonging, like you have to fight for belonging. You have a commitment. You have like people, like it's a bigger thing that's just beyond yourself. But like you say, like you've said it before, and I think it's true, arguably part of the problem is that a lot of people have meaning in conspiracies or fundamental or craziness, right? That's like the problem. And so I think refining the language where when we talk about meaning, there's different ways that can mean, right? And if not, then people are going to think they're going to regain meaning just because they say find a hobby or a practice or something. Well, if you find a hobby that you love, but then one day you go, it doesn't make a difference or nobody cares, it's going to feel like just suddenly this meaning-making practice will feel like you were just distracting yourself or you were, eating sweet like candy to distract yourself or something. So I think that distinction is very important, but let me give it to Trey.
Thanks. What Alexander was talking about with the Avengers is very interesting. And I think what you were saying, Daniel, is that it kind of remains within the logic of rationality. You were talking about rationality just then, and it's like Thanos is supremely rational, right? And at that level, at the rational level, he may even be ethical if we want to reduce ethics to rationality. And part of this, like an example of the rationality in Endgame is the Hulk. This is a point that my friend Chad A. Haag pointed out, that the Hulk is like the Hegelian dialectic, which is, we know, is not the correct form, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis form. And like the Hulk, you have angry, or you have Bruce Banner, and then you have the big angry Hulk, and then in Endgame we just put them together, and there we have the synthesis of the Hulk, who's kind of good and kind of evil. And that to me is just the great example of the logic of rationality, and it sucks that this is the stereotypical form of Hegel's dialectic, because Hegel is possibly the most not irrational, but he is probably has the most powerful critique of the logic of rationality and A=A logic and all that stuff. But one thing, just to respond to what Alexander was saying about the infinite self-relation and stuff, I agree to a certain extent, and I'm actually quite familiar with these ideas just because I came out of a sort of Žižekian background. Žižek really got me interested in philosophy, and I actually came to Orthodox Christianity through working through Žižek and encountering certain problems. And it was less that I became dissatisfied with Žižek, and more that I found a more holistic worldview and ontology in Christianity. Now, just to give my reasons for that and my problems with the logic of self-relation, because I've kind of came to the conclusion that the logic of self-relation is stands opposed to the logic of community and a communal sense of being, which you find in Christianity. And the thing with self-relation is that you use the example of a fist, which I know Hegel would probably say that this is an infinite self-relation, but for Žižek, the sort of self-relating negativity that that he wants to talk about exists less at the level of concrete reality and more at the level of just the subject itself. Actually, his critique of Fichte is that Fichte has this substantial self-positing I with all this determinate content, right? It creates its own world in a sense. And I know it's more ambiguous with Fichte because you have the Anstos and all that, but in any case, what Žižek says in Less Than Nothing is that Fichte's problem is that he's conceiving of the subject in an all too positive sense, but actually the subject is just this negativity, just this cut in reality, the cut in the symbolic order, to use Lacanese. But so my issue is more about, I think Žižek does have a way to account for this subject, the subject who is nothing more than this negativity, a positivized negativity, the void that can't remain stable and stuff. But when it comes to the empirical reality of life and stuff, and I think that this relation really with the other exists at this level of community. I don't think that Žižek can account for real relation. Like you were saying that there's some sort, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, Alexander. There's some isomorphism with the fist has with all of reality, because all of reality in a sense is an infinite self-relation. Every being is. I think that's what you're saying. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And what Žižek says, I think this is basically what Žižek says, because for Žižek, every subject is this absolute withdrawal of self-relating negativity. And it's precisely because we all share this alienation, this internal alienation, we are all united in the Holy Spirit. So that's his Christian atheism, right? Like Christ died on the cross, revealed that substance is subject, substance is self-divided. Then you have the coming of the Holy Spirit as the community of believers who all accept the death of God as the subjectivization of substance. I just I don't see how real relationality can be present at this level. Like, and that's kind of what that's what Christianity provides. And I know there is, and I'm very much aware of the critiques of Christianity where it does fall into ideology, it does fall into dogmatism and all these issues. But fundamentally, I think my reason for moving more towards a Christian view is that you have a firm ontological grounding of relationality as communion. And the last point, just because I think I kind of need to explain what I mean by communion, because these are actually new ideas, because of all the Eastern Orthodox fathers are kind of just being recently translated. Now they're coming into the online sphere. And what we mean by communion, I can give an example with the subject itself. Like for Zizek, there is this paradox of the fact that the subject is at its core, even though we can say that the human being is a self-conscious entity, at its core, the human being can't be conscious of itself, because if it's this point of consciousness, in order to be conscious of itself, it would have to step behind itself. So he uses this language of like stepping on your own shoulders, performing the impossible act. So there's always this hole in reality, this hole in the symbolic order, and that precisely is the subject as subtracted from reality. Now, the Orthodox position would be that you have, like in the context of the Trinity, you have the Father who, and this is a problem with monism, in my opinion. You get this, you eventually actually, monism leads to the Zizekian subject, I think, because you have this issue with how can the Father know himself in totality? The way traditional Christian theology has tended to answer this question is that the Father knows himself fully in the Son because the Son is fully his image. He has his same essence. He is God as well. And in giving himself to the Son then gives himself back to the Father. So you don't have these alienated perspectives that can never jump on their own shoulders and see themselves, but you have the perspective of the Father and then the perspective of the Son united in the Spirit, where the Son literally gives the Father his own identity back to him, so that reality actually can be complete, because you don't have this point that can never be accessed, which is for Zizek the subject itself, but you have the subject giving himself to another subject, and then the subject gives it back to him as a gift. And there's no more missing element, no more missing point in reality, because everyone can see themselves through the eyes of the other. Now, I know Zizek would not agree with that, and it does almost presuppose a sort of, the presupposition is a genuine theology. So, and I know that can be a limitation in these discussions, but I guess the main question is, how would you conceive of relation itself, like when you're talking about the infinite self-relation? Because to me, the only sort of relation, and I would grant it, the only sort of relation I can see is a relation of the mutual recognition of alienation that Zizek emphasizes. But for me, that doesn't really meet a standard of true relation understood as a communion, a unity.
Yeah. So just quickly, so you can substitute self for system, in my view. So infinite self, like it's infinite systemic or systematic relation. So this could be a group. It could be any boundaried entity, a fist, a group, a religion, whatever, that requires a certain saturation of relation. Now, by relation, we're relatively abstract, or we could be physical. If we want to talk physical emergence and those sorts of things. But in the abstract, the saturation of Christian relation is not that you all are orgying together and you're actually touching skin, but it's a saturation of ideas that imbibe and saturate and pervade an entire boundary system called Christianity, or your church, or whatever sort of. So you have the boundaried blah blah blah. Sorry, that threw me off. And then I was responding to. Okay, so you have the saturation. The relation relates to sort of anything. But what I was going to give him the example of, with like a real world example, is if you've ever felt seen. So he gave the example of like God sees his kid Jesus, and he's like, oh, that's me. And then Jesus comes back to God, and it's like this thing. But seeing Jesus, like if you went up to Jesus, like have you ever felt seen? Like you're like, oh my God, you see me. Have I done this routine for you already before? Okay. And you'd be like, oh my God, I feel like you really see me, that corny Burning Man sort of thing. And it's like, but I feel seen. Now, if I was to be like, well, Daniel, hi, I see you. You're so you're like you're a wedding facilitator guy who's a philosopher. And I say that to you, and I'm like, oh, I see you. You're a philosopher, wedding facilitator guy. Would you feel seen? No. No, not at all, right? That's not what we mean when you say, I feel seen. It's this indeterminate thing. If you're like, oh, Alex, I see you, you're a rock star, I'd be like, I'd shrink. You just objectified me. You did not see my indeterminate interior form, right? The singularity of me that cannot be spoken. Similarly, if you go to Jesus and you go, you're Jesus Christ, you think he's going to feel seen? No. Even if you said, you're God, no. The whole idea of the apophatic, of the immanence of God, is that he's not, he's unnameable, he's inspecific, right? And so that's what I mean by an infinite saturation of relation when we talk about the singularity. When we talk about what we really are fundamentally beneath the external front. And by infinite saturation of relation, we're talking about all the determinate forms possible. It's like the Walt Whitman, do I contradict myself? I contain multitudes. Very well, I contradict myself. We contain these multitudes, and the only time we're ever seen in our fullness is when we're not seen in our particularities. And that's what I mean by infinite internal saturation of relation.
No, that's very good. And I'll pass it as we come up on the end if anyone has fun. I'm so glad we all came together today. It's always wonderful to see you find people. And it is very interesting where, like, I know in different theological traditions or different language, but the notion of a beatific vision, like you don't really encounter God unless you have a beatific vision, which is this strange suspension. Like there's a suspension. Like if you're able to look, like if you're able to say to something, oh, you're God, there's a way in which you're not overwhelmed by the beauty as one should be if they were actually encountering God. So there's this weird paradox that kind of emerges where the truth is unveiled in an encounter that cannot label it as truth because it's so taken up in it. And to me, what you're speaking about indeterminacy, this is where what I'm talking about, and it would be another topic, why I think it's very important to focus on the foundation of metaphysics as the apprehensive act, not the labeling afterwards. So what I'll talk about is Derrida deconstructs metaphysics of crossing the signifier to the signified. He's like, you can't do that. I agree. But there is the apprehension of going, bam, that. Now, the moment you say bookcase, you've lost it because you've determined it. But there was an initial indeterminate apprehension that the human is capable of. And what is that? And that, if I were to go back, like if I were to say, like, what would defend us against standing reserve and all these different things, it's that bizarre act of apprehension before you label it. It's that bizarre indeterminate apprehension that we need to focus on. And I'm not going to sit here and say that AI will never be able to do that one day. I don't know. That's a different topic. T10, you're great. But that seems really important. And indeed, like when we talk about the thing that's very interesting about the Trinity is this notion of three persons, one essence, where the knowledge of each person of the Trinity comes from the other that are in a kind of dance. And what to me is an interesting question is if we think about dance, is dance a multiplicity or a singularity, right? It's both in this weird way. The dance is not possible without the individuals, and yet the individuals on their own could not make a dance emerge. And that weird, crazy claim we made that one net session is that technically people in a dance are separate, but practically they're not separate. They're all one, and the practical is more real than the technical. Like that's kind of the revelation, like when C.S. Lewis in the second Space Trilogy book, I think it's the best description like of the Christian Trinity, which is of a dance. That's kind of a weird indeterminacy. And yet it's also, it's not the case that like we're in the Trinity, right? Like the Trinity is a separate reality. And yet in that reality, it's indeterminate. So if the true infinity in Hegel is kind of like a circle, as opposed to a line, where a line is spurious, where a circle has a true infinity, what's funny about a circle is it's also contained, like it's a point where this circle is here. So it's like a being, and yet the circle is constituted by a ever becoming. So that's where you have the mixture of being and becoming. That's why it's like important, as you wrote in your paper, Mr. Ebert, like in Hegel, you don't have an autonomous becoming, nor do you have an autonomous being. It's this very strange point where the becoming becomes a being and the being is a becoming. And that's like the dance of the Trinity. And I do think like the Trinitarian life. So communal ontology and those different things are a kind of true infinity that has this mixture of a kind of dance where there is a multiplicity that is practically one, and the practical is more real than the technical. And I think when it comes to the question of AI and Heidegger and standing reserve, it would seem that that kind of thinking, that kind of metaphysics, that kind of ontology is really, really important. And indeed, coming to terms and figuring out how to integrate that into our own worldview and our own thinking is where I find Barfield interesting, Steiner interesting, these different people. And in fact, it would seem to me, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak as we come up on the end, some sort of thinking like this is going to be very important for the human to identify with if they're not going to feel useless. If the AI is not going to make them feel useless and irrelevant and replaceable, it's going to maybe, I'm not saying it necessarily will, it will be worth figuring out or trying at least. There might be resources in this domain of thought that can help the human being not just feel useless. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the case. Those things have to be explored, and what exactly would that mean would have to be investigated. But that seems to be where there might be something worth looking at, because I don't want to feel useless. I don't know about you guys. Feeling useless sounds sad, but then there's also a fear of feeling useless. And this is what's interesting. It's what I find very interesting about AI, precisely because it sucks so much, that's why it could be a good thing. Like facing all of the insecurities, facing all of the tensions, facing all of the feelings of being useless could actually be a negation sublation into something more, or it could be an effacement. As we've talked about with Hegel, all of these big moments are contingent. If you can get through them, it's progressive. But if you don't, well, that sucks. The future is better than the past, but there's no assumption that there's a future, right? And so there is, in one way, it's like the AI is going to force human beings to like really examine themselves and say, what is it that humans can do that's like unique? And maybe it's nothing. And so then that will suck. But then forcing the question seems like it could be an opportunity. If I'm putting a positive spin on it, there could be an opportunity here. And to me, it seems to have something to do with some of these metaphysical notions that have been put forth on the many and the one, the dance, the communal, the Trinitarian, the saturation, things like that. It seems certainly worth. But let me give it to whoever wants to speak as we come up at the end. I'm very much enjoyed this, and I'm glad the wind didn't take out my internet. So one never knows with these quite crazy weather. I can do a song and dance routine. Maybe like the Carpenters. Why do birds suddenly appear every time you are near? Just like me, they long to be close to you. So anyway, let's work toward not feeling useless. We live on a farm. I'm pretty sure that we've at least got an extra 20 years before the AI can do our garden. So if anyone wants to come and help with the garden, we've at least can buy some time before the robots can do the planting for us. So, we can feel some belonging. Maybe it all comes back to Voltaire, tend one's garden and different things. So that's always available. But with that, I will run unless anyone has final things. Please, Mr. Ebert.
No, you just paused at this like really cool moment. And then you came back and you're like, but with that, I'll let it go. No, this is a stupid observation, but you just reminded me because of the comment about gardening that, it used to be like Asimov. I don't know if Asimov like invented the word robot, but I kind of think he might have. He took it from Russian. In Russian, it just means to work. Anyhow. The initial idea, of course, that robots were going to do our menial tasks for us, so be garbage men for us and plow the field for us. What's interesting is I don't think that's going to happen. What's interesting is that the jobs AI is going to take over are all of the high profile gigs, right? All the things that require intelligence. Scoring movies like me, making music, making films, building other technology, building bombs, ethical decisions, governmental decisions, all of this stuff, how to connect people to one another, like who should belong with whom, sorting us into different, all of these things, while the only thing that will probably still be worth, be useful for are actually these sort of like labor tasks, which starts to sound a lot like a master race, slave race sort of relationship, where we're doing these sort of we're working in the field while AI is taking care of everything else. And that could be cool. I mean, I wouldn't be opposed to some manual labor, but I could probably use it. I'd probably be a lot healthier if I did that. Maybe this is a good thing, but it is interesting that the whole concept of AI and robots and whatnot were to relieve us of the more burdensome tasks, and now the opposite is sort of happening.
No, a few things. Trey, thank you for being here, sir. I really appreciate it. It's actually fun. Michelle and I, the other night, we're having a really extensive, and then I'll give it to Jacob, on the great irony where like AI, like all the white collar jobs or whatever that was supposed to be really secure are actually like the first that are going to get wiped away. Whereas like blue collar job and different things are probably secure, at least for a really long time. It seems really difficult to imagine a robot that could do your gardening, your sweeping, your cleaning. And even if it was possible, the economic barrier of buying like robots for the average person that could do those things would be like forever away, right? And the last thing I'll say, it's really fun because everyone today is like saying, oh, we got to get back to the body. We got to be embodied. We can't be sticks on a, brains on a stick. Don't you worry, that's coming. There's going to be a whole lot of embodiment getting back to the body. But let me give it to Jacob.
Yeah, nothing further to add. Just thank you all for the dialogue. I really appreciated the spontaneous silence that occurred right after your final thread a few minutes ago. And yeah, just wonderful contributions, really stimulating stuff from Mr. Iba as well. Yeah, very thankful for this.
Well, it's always a blast to have you, Jacob. Thank you so much. And yeah, so it is really funny how everything might pan out. So anyway, everyone, thank you so much for your time today.